What are some biological factors that may influence people in this room taking a quiz? Sleep. They're tired. They don't feel well. Anxiety. What about just cognitive capacity or intelligence? It varies, like it does vary in the room. So maybe somebody in the room might have like a genius level, 160 IQ, and maybe there's somebody who would have, an IQ of 85. Maybe there are differences in there. But as a behaviorist, it's not that I don't care and I'm not sensitive to biological differences. There's just nothing I could do about it, right? There's nothing you can do about it. You're at where you're at. But how do you make you perform like the best way that you can given what you have? And there are different things that I can do as a teacher, and there are different things that you can do as a student to change kind of the context and hopefully increase your scores and your performance in your classes. So here's quiz grades. Okay, somebody tell me who's read chapter 2, and I hope everybody did. What kind of a graph is this? Histogram, right? Histogram. It's like a frequency distribution histogram. So here on the x-axis we have the score, and over here is the frequency of occurrence. What does the frequency of occurrence mean? How many times? How many people? So how many people did not complete the quiz at all? Four. And that's a score of 0, right? If you look at, again, if you've done the reading, and you look at the shape, what would you say the shape of this is?
Approximate coordination.
What is it?
Approximate coordination.
Well, close. You have one of the terms right. It's not the correlation.
It's skewed.
Is it positively skewed or is it negatively skewed? Negatively skewed. Why is it negatively skewed? Right. So it's here. So what does that really tell you about like the performance of the class in general? More people did good. Now some people, and this is like why instructors are a little different, they would look at this and they're like, I had too many people do too well on this. I have to make it harder. So they say that it's too easy, right? But it depends on what you're doing. Like I want you guys to perform well. You know, the point of these are so you have access into what a test is like, and a test is worth way more points than this quiz is, right? So you have your books open, you have all your notes available to you, and what if you scored a 4? And I'm not picking on people who have 4. I'm just saying this is the best time for you to see how you're doing and what to do differently. Like I don't want to wait until exam 1 and put this up here.
I used the 7th edition and I found all the answers, so I don't think it's a big deal.
Okay. And here's the thing about the textbook, and I know a lot of people have asked me about the textbook. It's up to you what you choose, but I'm doing the exams and the quiz, and everything is going to be based on the 8th edition. So maybe for chapter 1 it's okay, and another chapter it's different. I don't know. So it's up to you what you choose to do, and maybe you're going to be fine with the 7th edition. So maybe whether or not you have the 7th or 8th edition doesn't matter about how you perform here. Maybe some people down here have ordered the book, they wanted to make sure they wanted to stay in the class, and they don't have it yet. And you'd probably struggle on this quiz if you didn't have the book, because a lot of it was coming from the book alone and not lecture, right? So it's positively skewed, meaning there's more people who did well. If you are getting like a 70, 60, 50, or 40, and you were really, trying, you read the book, you gave it your best effort, come and talk to me, okay? And we could see what's happening, because I don't know if you guys remember, but 150 points in the class are for quizzes. And there's only 14 quizzes, so I basically give people a quiz, right? So say your computer difficulties, or you're at a wedding, or something like that. There are no makeup quizzes, but I give you 10. So if you perform like a 4, maybe this is where you're going to get kind of those extra points. So it's not the end of the world yet, which is why I wanted to come up and like talk to you about these things. But you don't want to continue like this. You don't want to fail. I don't want you to fail my class. There's no need to fail my class. Come and bug me in my office every week. I mean, that's fine. But I want you to do well. Now, what kind of graph is it? Same information from chapter 2. This is histogram, right? The bars. Same thing with the lines. What is it called?
Frequency polygram.
Is it? Yes, frequency polygram. Perfect. decrease in psychologists doing assessment, which is interesting because throughout the past century, that's what has defined psychologists. We're assessors, right? What some of the reasons behind that is because we're involved in other activities, and we name things like consulting, administrative, being like directors of clinics, academics, all these sorts of things. And our scope of our practice is like widening. There are some criticisms about the validity and reliability of some assessments, and we're going to talk, there's a whole chapter or two on reliability and validity. Basically, the validity is the measuring what it's intended to measure. So if it says it's measuring intelligence, does it really measure that? Or if it says it's measuring depression, does it really measure that? Reliability is the consistency of scores. So example, if I had the quiz 1 grade and say you got an 8, hopefully you get around an 8 again if I gave it to you like again in a week, right? So there's some stability in it versus one time you could take it, get a 2, and another 10, and just kind of so variable that it's not really consistent. So I can't really trust the score very much. Some of them, especially that hit, are some of the personality tests, particularly the projective tests. And who can tell me what projective tests are? Projective personality versus structure.
You're supposed to find meaning.
Yeah, ambiguous stimuli, like the ink blot, like showing you that. What do you see? Right? For the most part, it doesn't help at all. It's not reliable and valid. Like one of the only things it is for psychosis. But I'll tell you what, if I had 5 minutes with somebody who is psychotic, I could let you know we wouldn't have to go through like a Rorschach test for that.
What do psychotic people do with that test?
It's more of like not necessarily the responses themselves, but like what they're saying. Like you could pick up delusions, for example. Like you show them and be like, oh, you see, it's like the CIA. They're like after to get me, and there they are right there. Or they're responding at like word salad or their thought processes, and we're going to talk about that more when we're going to clinical interviewing, and I'll give you specific examples, even video examples, particularly with psychosis, so you can kind of get a sense that there's something off about this person, but you would just get that by talking to them, right? So they're just wondering if it's worth all that training, because Exner, who did the Rorschach, has 4 different volumes of the Rorschach, this thick. There's like this intense coding process. It takes a lot of time to train, graduate students in the Rorschach, supervised experience. All this time and energy when it's not really producing anything, right? It's not really reliable and valid. It's giving, bad, information. And if it's the only thing that it does is help determine whether or not a person is psychotic, I'd say that there are easier, cheaper means in order to do that. And the other reason is the reduction in reimbursement. So that's another thing that's been difficult with like managed care. So a lot of people with their insurance companies, you get an X amount of therapy sessions. What do you have? You have depression. Well, I'll give you like 10 therapy sessions for that. Anything outside of that, then you have to pay for personally. So with assessment, a lot of the managed care or insurance companies aren't paying for it, right? So if a psychologist isn't going to get reimbursed for their work, they're probably not going to do it. And some of these assessments can take a long time, especially if you're giving a test battery. And what is a test battery again? A series of tests. So I could spend 8+ hours on this and not get reimbursed for it. It makes it less likely that I'm going to do it. So assessment is a lot of different things. It's structured and unstructured interviews, behavioral observations. Who could give me an example of something that a psychologist does that would be like behavioral observations?
Well, where you put the people and you watch them how they're
Yeah,
behaving.
you watch them. So for example, maybe I work in a center for autism and developmental disabilities, and I get a referral question like, I need a treatment plan for somebody who is head banging, right? So they're going against the wall and they're like going like this all day, right? One of the first things that I might do is just see how many times they're doing that day. So, doing it in a day or an hour. So if I do an intervention, I could see if the intervention is actually working and that behavior is decreasing. Or
You ask questions.
You
You ask questions. You ask questions, like to the child or whatever.
Like, those kids with ADHD, like they try to figure out if the child's hyper, what's going on.
Right. And that's really important to ask different sorts of questions. And I would say that that'd be more of like the interview, maybe interviewing the child. Behavioral observations might be you're maybe watching them and somebody with ADHD in the classroom. How many times are they getting out of their chair? Or how many times are they interrupting their teacher? Or how many times are they, does it look like they're not paying attention? But you have to operationally define that. I'll give you another example. I was working on my teaching, I told you I was so scared in my first semester teaching ever. And I had undergrads in our lab who took data, and it was behavioral observations. So like one of my target behaviors was I had to move around to the podium. I couldn't stay here because I was kind of stuck, gripping for my life, right? So I had to move, and then they would mark how many times I was just kind of stuck here, and then they'd give me feedback on that. But they're just observing and reporting behavior. Neuropsych assessment, I've already talked to you a little bit about. It's looking more at organic impairment, looking at there's something wrong with your brain. Where are you? Maybe it's your prefrontal cortex. What is impacted by damage or lesion to your prefrontal cortex? And using assessment as part of the overall therapy process, we've already talked about. There's also, it's getting more and more computerized. So I don't know how many of you have participated in research here. You probably got a lot of online surveys. It's just a lot easier. So instead of having people have to do all that data entry, it's just already in there. But there's actually, it's controversial because a lot of these tests have been validated, so making sure that they're valid and reliable with paper and pencil, but they haven't been computer. And some people said it shouldn't matter at all. The tests would be the same. And then the other camp is that you have to also show that it's reliable and valid in a computer form. I would say that's probably fine unless you're working with an elderly person or somebody who's never been around computers before, but it is controversial. And a lot of the scoring, for example, like the MMPI, which is the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, it's like 500 some questions. It's now computerized, and there's a certain way that you have to score it. You have to do these templates over it. It's time consuming by hand, and so there's more rapid computer scoring for some of these tests now. So the other important thing is, in organizational context, so for the job, for instance, employment, you're wanting to say what will this person be good at in my job, or will this person make a good employee? These sorts of questions, it's been shown, using assessment has been shown to be very helpful at placing in people in particular jobs and showing whether or not somebody's going to be successful as an employee. So the evidence for assessment in these contexts has shown to be effective. So they're using it. That's why I say if you want to make a lot of money in psychology, be industrial organizational psychology, or working with businesses and companies. In healthcare settings, like most people in here are interested in therapy context or things like that, using personality inventories and all other things, it has yet to be demonstrated that using these sorts of assessments increases the speed of treatment or optimizes treatment outcome. So if I'm going to be doing an 8-hour assessment, doing personality and all these sorts of things, and I'm requesting money for it, I'm doing my time, their time, and it's not improving outcomes or it's not changing how I would develop a treatment plan, how useful is it, right? So this is one of the questions, again, why maybe assessment isn't used as much, but it really does need to be demonstrated. And what's scary about it in the field of psychology, if this is what separates us from everyone else, and we can't show that it works or that we're useful, what is our future as psychologists? Interesting. Okay. I'm just going to go into the next. You guys can just read about the history of psychological testing in Chapter 1. We'll go as far as intelligence, history, intelligence. We're going to go in that more depth in that particular chapter. So it's just kind of an overview so we see where we're heading. All right. Why do we need statistics? Great question, especially if you hate statistics. I'll tell you, I'm not very fond of it myself, and it's one of those things that I had to force myself to learn, right? You have to know basic statistics in order to be like a psychologist and do well. There's some people who are way better at it than I am, or they just do it as a focus, and they're very coveted in the field. It's very good to kind of have your hands on somebody who's interested in statistics.
What job actually uses this in their everyday?
All of them. They should. Here's why. I'm not saying that you have to be able to calculate statistics. I'm sure people in here were maybe calculating ANOVAs and stuff like that. I have never had to calculate an ANOVA by hand since I did that. You just do that with computer testing, on computers. Why statistics? Knowing about statistics is now that I have this output from this ANOVA, what does this mean? And that's important. As somebody who's a clinician and maybe is just providing therapy, it's important. You have to do continued education. What do you know what that? So like every year or two, you're required to take so many. It's not a college course like this, but like workshops or seminars to keep up your skills. That you're, this kind of psychology assessment therapy. It changes over time, so you want to make sure that you're updated in the most current information. So it's kind of like a lifelong learning. So you're providing therapy, you want to be able to read research articles or evaluate the research coming out. There are over 500 different types of therapies, and some of them have like zero evidence showing that it's effective. So one of the things to be important is if I'm providing therapy, I want to make sure that it's been demonstrated to be effective for the person that's in front of me. And how do I determine whether it's effective or not? And that's by being able to evaluate the research that's coming out. So it doesn't mean that you have to conduct it. So most of you are just being master's level clinicians. You're unlikely to go out there and do a bunch of this research yourself. But you're evaluating these sorts of things. It depends as a social worker. If you're doing a social worker and you're doing therapy, I would say yes. I say anybody who's doing therapy needs to have a basic understanding in order to evaluate the treatments that you're giving and the assessments that you're providing. Social work is a little bit different. I'm not as knowledgeable about it. Some of them do therapy, some of them do more community resources, but they have a better idea of what you need to do your job well. So I'm not sure. But statistics helps us learn more about the world. So for example, when you guys got your quiz score feedback right away, say you got an 8. It's hard to know what that means, right? Without what we did before. When I showed up the graphs of the frequency, polygon, and a histogram, it's what kind of statistics? Is it descriptive or inferential? Descriptive, right? So that's what a lot of people want to know. What was the average of the class? What did the distribution look like? So it makes your score have more meaning. So we get all this data out in the real world, no matter what study we're doing or assessment. We need statistics to help show how that score has meaning. Otherwise, you got an 8. I mean, I don't know what else to say, right? So statistics will show like an estimate of the extent to which observations could have been influenced by chance alone. So let's do a basic, I'm a treatment development researcher, so let's do a basic treatment study. What is a randomized clinical trial? Anybody know? You take research design.
Random people.
Right. So.
You just get the people as they come.
The chance.
Right. So say you guys are going to be my sample, right? And random is I flip a coin or do a computer-generated number thing. So you'll go say I'm comparing acceptance and commitment therapy and behavioral cognitive therapy for depression. So I have 2 different treatments, and I want to see if they perform the same or if one is superior than the other in alleviating depressive symptoms. Okay. Why is random assignment important?
Because if it's not a control for certain persons or people, you get a better idea of what the general population is.
Right. You want to make in order to do that, you want to make the conditions as similar as possible. So say we're doing just I want to do some sort of intervention in the classroom or something, I'm going to divide this class in half. What if I, and this isn't, nobody take offense to it, just a generalization. What if I cut that class in half, we're looking at grades, and I cut like the upper half and the back half? Versus randomly flipping a coin. Why? How that might affect my study?
The people who sit in the front may be different than the people who sit in the back.
Right. The people in the front may be different than the people who sit in the back. Studies have shown, technically, and again, most of the time, when people sit up front, they earn better grades than when people sit in the back. This is just well-known fact. Not that people in the back, make poor grades. I mean, I know Orlando makes great grades. So it's not always the case, but it's generally the case. And that's another thing you could do as far as if you're trying to, everybody in this room said they wanted to get into graduate school, and grades are so important for that. Even if you just come and sit up at the front of the room, it increases the chance that, one, that you're going to pay attention, but also, I might be a little bit different, but where instructors are looking most of the time? The front. The front, not even the whole front, but what's in their visual frame, so it's like here, right? It's like they're lecturing right here, behind the podium, right? Versus kind of walking around, I'm trying to make contact with everybody because I'm aware of this. But that's one reason why random assignment wouldn't work, because I wouldn't really know whether my intervention improved grades, because there's this confound. And a confound is like a variable that might be another explanation for your results besides the intervention. So randomized clinical trial, done with treatment, so I have acceptance and commitment therapy versus cognitive behavioral therapy on the treatment of depression. So I want to make sure that it wasn't by chance alone. So I have to put your guys' numbers, maybe your scores on the Beck's depression inventory in there, and I have to compare scores statistically to make sure that any differences between the two groups wouldn't have been just by the chance alone, but that it's large enough and has statistical significance that it is unlikely to happen by chance, those differences in scores. And statistics is the only way that we'd be able to tell that. So descriptive statistics are a concise description of a collection of quantitative information. So again, it's like mean, mode, median, those frequency distributions that we saw. It's describing the data, but it's not making the comparisons between the acceptance commitment therapy and cognitive behavioral therapy. That would be inferential statistics, where you're making inferences from observations of a small group of people known as a sample to a larger group of individuals known as a population. And I'm going to explain this a little bit more, okay? So say I want to ask this question. Okay. Should students pay the same interest rates on loans as big banks get from the Fed? And this is a big question. I don't know if people know that the interest rate for student loans have increased. And somebody was pushing, I can't remember her name, is pushing for our interest rates to be the same as big banks. Why do we have students pay a lot more than big banks? They should be the same. So say I want to get an idea of what the population thinks. But the population is hard to have access to. Can I really survey every every person in the United States? No. There's no way that I could do that. So we say that's the population of interest. What do you think people in the United States think? That should students pay the same interest rates as banks? So what people will do, they'll get a sample. So it'll be a subset of the population that's easier to get. Okay. So this is similar to the random assignment as far as how we select our sample will impact the results that we get. So say if I ask people in this room, do you guys think that you should get lower interest rates like the same as those who of the big banks? I bet everybody would raise their hand, yes, I do, because it directly affects you. But what if I went and asked some other people who it just doesn't affect them? They didn't go to college, they're not paying student loans, they're not affected by it at all. They may have a different answer to that, saying, oh, well, our economy needs the more money that's generated by higher interest rates, right? So who I'm sampling will affect what this is, which is important when you're seeing like these different things on news. Maybe CNN says, poll, this percent of the United States believes that, Obama should be president, or something like that. Who's their sample? Who are they doing? It matters, like, geographically, what ethnicities, what genders, like all these different components matter in finding meaning in the results in these inferential statistics. But again, inferential statistics, they're taking this small group, this small sample. So maybe instead of everybody in the United States, my sample is maybe 20,000 people in the United States. The inferential statistics helps make us talk about the larger population in general versus just what we sample. So we're making these inferences of this is what our sample is, but this is how we think it's going to be for the whole population just based on our sample. And why this matters is we're going to go into scales of measurement. So not everything that we use or every question or assessment or every behavior, we can't use inferential statistics on everything. There's certain requirements, right? So scales of measurement. Measurement is just the application of rules for assigning numbers. So say I want to, one of the things that I'm interested in is I want to do a study on weight loss. So I'm going to weigh people. What is my scale of measurement? I'm likely going to be pounds and not ounces or something, you know what I mean? So what is it that you're using? Inches for height. And you have to lay this out ahead of time. And some things it can be very easy, especially when you're talking about some more biological things like weight, height, blood pressure. They're more exact. But what would you do? How would you measure? We're all doing a presentation in this class. So how would you measure the quality of a presentation? What questions would you ask, or how would you measure that? So that's one thing you could do. So I could send out something saying, I want you to let me know how much time you spent on 5 hours, 60 hours. I expect 60 hours of work for them. So eye contact, so I could look at some presentation skills. Are they making eye contact? Are they reading off their notes? How informative were? What else? Do they know what they're talking about? Are they accurate?
Where they get their sources from?
Right. So do they have an answer? The quality of that answer. But it's hard, okay? So I'm trying to measure the quality of your response. How am I judging that? And how am I assigning a grade to that? By number scale, like 1 to 10?
Yeah.
What does a 10 mean versus an 8? You see how tricky it is? No, this is the point. This is the point. It is so tricky, especially when we go to the psychological measurement versus some of the ones for the hard sciences. Weight is easy. There it is. It's on the scale. But what if I'm saying, how depressed a person is, or anxiety, or intelligence? How am I measuring intelligence?
Or pain, when they tell you pain from 1 to 10, how do you feel?
Exactly, and pain is very, very subjective, right?
Depends on the person.
It depends on the person, right? So somebody's 10 could be another person's 5.
Yeah.
But you see some people in the hospital making a lot of judgments, based on what they say their number is, but sometimes they're really in a lot of pain, and it's hard for them to experience the level of pain that they're experiencing. But again, I could do the same study, right, on pain, and you may have an 8, and you may also have an 8, but the meaning of those are very, very different.
Well,
It gets individualized.
Isn't that why they have the little faces that show?
They do.
Yeah, because when I take my daughter, they cover the numbers and they ask her to pick what face she feels, and then they don't even ask the number anymore. They exactly look at the faces.
Right. I mean, the thing is, when we get to psychological conditions, it's harder and it's more imprecise. We do the best that we can. For example, we're doing anxiety treatment, PTSD treatment, as something called prolonged exposure. So one of them are these in vivo treatments or in vivo exercises. So what happens with some people who get PTSD? They might stay in their house and not want to go out anywhere. Or they will only go to the grocery store if it's 2 in the morning. Or they won't go anywhere near the side of the town that they were raped, or something like that. So we would have them do like a fear hierarchy, right? So what is there you're most scared to do? What are you like least scared to do? What is like in the middle, kind of up and down? And we have them start lower and then go up higher, basically. But even that's pretty subjective, right? So we always do like on 100. We say like for 100. This is like you've never been this scared in your entire life. Like this was the most scared you've ever been. So you're trying to help them make their own scale. And for each person, their scale would be a little bit different. Maybe my top thing wouldn't be your top thing. You know, maybe my top thing is like, I don't want to be anywhere a snake, right? And you're like, I have a pet snake. I just put him over my head, right? I mean, it looks very different from each person. But same with depression. Intelligence, it gets very imprecise, which makes it challenging and interesting at the same time. So before we go into what scales are, we evaluate the scales based on the properties of the scales, and there's 3, okay? The magnitude is this property of moreness, like height or extroversion. So if I put people in line, some of you would be like taller than others. There's a sense of moreness. Some people would be heavier than others. Some will be more extrovert than others. Some people will be more anxious than others, right? And then there's also the property of equal intervals. So it's the difference between 2 points at a place on a scale that has the same meaning as the difference between 2 other points that differ by the same scale units. So one of the easiest examples is just like a ruler. The difference between 2 and 4 inches, that difference is the very same as 10 and 12 inches. They're equal on the same scale, right? Most psychologist tests do not have this property. So IQ tests, for instance, yours between 110 and 105, and average IQ is 100. So these people are probably going to be functioning pretty well. So if we had 2 people in this class who had an IQ of 105 or 110, they could perform, about the same, right? They have the capability to perform about the same. But if I had somebody with super low IQ of 45 and 50, the differences that I would see are much bigger. So even though there's only 5 points in between the 2, they're not the same at different points on the scale. And then there's the property of absolute 0, which is attained when nothing of the property being measured exists. So like heart rate, you could be dead. So you could have like a heart rate of 0, right? This is also rare for a psychological test because usually everybody experiences even the tiniest bit of anxiety about something, like this small. There's not an absence of anxiety. It's like a human emotion. There's not an absence of human sadness. You know what I mean? So it's very rare to have an absolute 0. So the types of scales, we have the nominal scales, which actually isn't really a scale at all, but its purpose is to name objects. So male, female, ethnicity, freshman, sophomore, junior, senior. It just puts people into a category. Okay. So usually, like in a survey, it's all the demographic information. There's the ordinal scale of measurements that allows you to rank individuals, but it's not easy to say anything meaningful about the differences between ranks. So everybody in this class who took quiz 1, I could put you in like a rank. But when I put into these statistics, it doesn't put your score next to that. It only says your rank. So if I look at the statistics, it only speaks to ranks, but I don't have any score information about your score when I'm using these. Here's what's interesting. Like most psychology tests are technically ordinal because in order to go to the next scale, we have the interval and the ratio scales. It requires the property of equal intervals. So we talked about properties before. So ordinal has a property of magnitude. like you performed higher than somebody else did on this quiz. So there's this moreness, magnitude. Equal intervals, what is the difference between like an 8 and a 10 versus like a 4 and a 6 in this class? They're not equal. But most psychologists, this is another area that's very controversial, will use psychological measurements as interval scales. Why do you think that is? And not ordinal?
You can use certain types of tests with intervals, but you can't use the ordinal.
Right. So here it comes, is we're trying to use certain types of statistical analyses. And based on the scale of measurement that we're using depends on what statistics we are able to run. So being in psychology, like we want to run all these statistics, it is the same as the hard sciences, and they do that by pushing it up to interval scales, which it has its pros and cons. It's very controversial, but it's typically done that way. I won't trick you on like a test or a quiz or something like that. I won't give you a psychological measurement, and you're going to have to say ordinal or interval. But I want you to know, I would expect you to know that they're controversial. They're technically ordinal, but they're used as interval, typically, so people can run analyses. So again, nominal scales don't have any of those properties. And what are the three properties we're talking about? Magnitude equals zero, right? So nominal doesn't have any of those. So it's not really, it's considered, they're labeled a scale of measurement, but it really isn't one. Ordinal only has a property of magnitude. Interval scales have both magnitude and equal intervals, like temperature in Fahrenheit or Celsius. So the difference between 60 and 70, those degrees of temperature is the same as it is with 20 and 30. It's 10 degrees difference. But there's no absolute zero. There's not like an absence of temperature, right? The ratio scale, we don't use this much in psychology, but it has all three properties, okay? The Kelvin scale is an example of that, because there's a point at which all molecular activity ceases. But well, I guess sometimes it depends on what we say. If there's an absence of it, like the number of yards gained in football, like you could not move at all, right? Or speed of travel, I could be not moving at all. So sometimes it's used in studies, but not often. Not some of these measurements that we're really focusing on in this class. So this is something you're definitely wanting to know for quizzes and tests or the scales of measurements, whether they have which properties